Hello everyone, it's good to be back. Today I wanted to talk about the challenge of individuality and individual thought in our modern times, and we'll be pulling from two different books from Carl Jung, two essays on analytical psychology and the symbolic life. I've pulled some selected paragraphs from these two books to help us, to guide us through our discussion today. I'm excited to get into it, so let's get started. Society, by automatically stressing all the collective qualities in its individual representatives, puts a premium on mediocrity, on everything that settles down to vegetate in an easy, irresponsible way. Individuality will inevitably be driven to the wall. This process begins in school, continues at the university, and rules all departments in which the state has a hand. In a small social body, the individuality of its members is better safeguarded, and the greater is their relative freedom and the possibility of conscious responsibility. Without freedom, there can be no morality. I recently started thinking about the paradox of individual expression in today's social climate. In one regard, we are fortunate to have essentially limitless tools at our disposal to augment and enable self-expression. For example, today, more than any other time in history, we are surrounded by essentially limitless options for various types of music, clothing, reading, all forms of media. And not only that, but we also have the ability to express ourselves, to express our thoughts and our opinions on these social forums that have a very low barrier to entry and the potential to reach countless others. And as we know, these social forums reward us with attention. We're talking about various forms of social media today. And as social beings, we are naturally driven to want this attention. We are driven to try to gain this recognition from others. And this striving for attention leads us to naturally coalesce around various ways of thinking, speaking, different tropes and memes, all in an effort to capitalize on what is inevitably vogue at the time. Human beings have one faculty which, though it is of the greatest utility for collective purposes, is most pernicious for individuation, and that is the faculty of imitation. Collective psychology cannot dispense with imitation, for without it, all mass organizations, the state, and the social order are impossible. Society is organized, indeed, less by law than by the propensity to imitation, implying equally suggestibility, suggestion, and mental contagion. But we see every day how people use, or rather abuse, the mechanism of imitation for the purpose of personal differentiation. They are content to ape some eminent personality, some striking characteristic or mode of behavior, thereby achieving an outward distinction from the circle in which they move. We could almost say that as a punishment for this, the uniformity of their minds with those of their neighbors, already real enough, is intensified into an unconscious, compulsive bondage to the environment. As a rule, these specious attempts at individual differentiation stiffen into a pose, and the imitator remains at the same level as he always was, only several degrees more sterile than before. To find out what is truly individual in ourselves, profound reflection is needed, and suddenly we realize how uncommonly difficult the discovery of individuality is. Now, this capacity for imitation is not inherently bad, as Jung just described. It's a very natural thing. When it's used for likes online, it's essentially inert, albeit it may lead to somewhat boring discussion at times, but it's not really destructive. X really said Y. Bro really is him. X is crazy. I didn't know X was chill like that. Or it's just the same 10 visual memes, photographs used as comments under each post. And the posts themselves are blatant imitations of others. And I'm not just talking about people taking general direction from others in terms of the style of their content, but people verbatim copying others' ideas. And then you look at the comments on those posts, which are copies of other posts, and you see that the comments themselves are also the same. And you get into this position where you start to see how almost most dystopian it all is. It's just memes all the way down. Yet this is still not necessarily a real issue. But when we get into the realm of political opinion and ideas, philosophical ideas of how to orient yourself in life, it becomes less innocent. And these types of ideas are influenced in the same way as these humorous and lighthearted memes are. There is a destination, a possible goal beyond the alternative stages dealt with in our last chapter. That is the way of individuation. Individuation means becoming an individual, and insofar as individuality embraces our innermost, last, and incomparable uniqueness, it also implies becoming one's own self. We could therefore translate individuation as coming to selfhood or self-realization. The possibilities of development discussed in the preceding chapters were, at bottom, alienations of the self, ways of divesting the self of its reality in favor of an external role or in favor of an imagined meaning. In the former case, the self retires into the background and gives place to social recognition. In the latter, to the auto-suggestive meaning of a primordial image. In both cases, the collective has the upper hand. Self-alienation in favor of the collective corresponds to a social ideal. It even passes for social duty and virtue, although it can also be misused for egotistical purposes. Egoists are called selfish, but this naturally has nothing to do with the concept of self as I am using it here. On the other hand, self-realization seems to stand in opposition to self-alienation. This misunderstanding is quite general because we do not sufficiently distinguish between individualism and individuation. Individualism means deliberately stressing and giving prominence to some supposed peculiarity rather than to collective considerations and obligations, but individuation means precisely the better and more complete fulfillment of the collective qualities of the human being, since adequate consideration of the peculiarity of the individual is more conducive to a better social performance than when the peculiarity is neglected or suppressed. The idiosyncrasy of an individual is not to be understood as any strangeness in his substance or in his components, but rather as a unique combination or gradual differentiation of functions and faculties which in themselves are universal. Every human face has a nose, two eyes, etc. But these universal factors are variable, and it is this variability which makes individual peculiarities possible. Individuation, therefore, can only mean a process of psychological development that fulfills the individual qualities given. In other words, it is a process by which a man becomes the definite, unique being he in fact is. In so doing, he does not become selfish in the ordinary sense of the word, but is merely fulfilling the peculiarity of his nature. And this, as we have said, is vastly different from egotism or individualism. These collective ideas capture their audience, and over the years many have thought that it's the younger generations that are more susceptible to this sort of thing, but I see it just as often among the older generations, particularly on social media sites like Facebook. People are increasingly so just outsourcing their thought, their analysis of life to strangers online. And nuance within ideas, it's not rewarded in the same way that oversimplified, one-sided views are. I believe that part of the reason for this is a lack of education, generally speaking, and I don't mean to suggest that less people are going through the rigors, so to speak, of the educational system, but I feel that the educational system itself is failing more and more, year after year. I feel that it's breaking down and it's becoming a hollow shell of what it was intended to be. It certainly seems to be failing in terms of promoting this idea of individual thought and the utility of personal reading. Now we have these political movements that spiral in these unipolar directions, and this is aided by their potential for virality. In a landscape populated by consumers who have been molded to accept ideas wholesale based not on the merits of the ideas themselves, but on the perception that others are doing the same, that others are also accepting these ideas as truth. And it's not difficult to see how this process is divorced from critical appraisal of the ideas themselves. Individuation cuts one off from personal conformity and hence from collectivity. That is the guilt which the individuant leaves behind him for the world. That is the guilt he must endeavor to redeem. He must offer ransom in place of himself. That is, he must bring forth values which are an equivalent substitute for his absence in the collective personal sphere. Without this production of values, final individuation is immoral and, more than that, suicidal. The man who cannot create values should sacrifice himself consciously to the spirit of collective conformity. In doing so, he is free to choose the collectivity to which he will sacrifice himself. Only to the extent that a man creates objective values can he and may he individuate. Every further step in individuation creates new guilt and necessitates new expiation. Hence, individuation is possible only so long as substitute values are produced. Individuation is exclusive adaptation to inner reality and hence an allegedly mystical process. The expiation is adaptation to the outer world. It has to be offered to the outer world with the petition that the outer world accept it. Now, in part, what Jung is saying here is that to divorce oneself from the collective is not a decision that is to be taken lightly. You stop relying on collective attitudes to define your own identity. And in doing so, you draw psychological authority from within the self rather than from others, from the collective whole. By undergoing this process, you personally elect to make a minority of yourself and to dispense with the comfort of being within the group. This naturally generates a sort of tension. Jung, in the paragraph we just discussed, referenced it as a sort of guilt. This tension is then resolved by compensation through the fruits of one's own individuality, providing a sort of utility for the group as a whole. This essentially asserts that the process of individuality is not a selfish process for the individual alone, but rather it's emblematic of a sort of hero's journey into the unknown to collect new information and then bring it back to the group for the betterment of the whole. If one were to never leave the collective in the first place, then stagnation would naturally ensue. Yet, if one were incapable of bearing this responsibility alone, and this again is where Jung is pragmatic, then they would most likely be better off, psychologically speaking, just remaining within the collective. Now, if Jung were to see the effect that social media has had on us today, I honestly do not think he would be that surprised. It falls within the realm of things that he has described time and time again. These sorts of problems and this sort of pattern has played out since the beginning of civilization. The difference today is that social media dramatically speeds up the rate by which these ideas spread. If I were to make a suggestion as we approach the end of this video, it would be to have the courage to protect some time for yourself, some time where you're not consuming ideas and media and thoughts from others, but where you are alone with your own thoughts, able to critically appraise things from your own perspective. Allow yourself to have a more nuanced take on certain issues. Allow yourself to weigh the various sides of an argument, and then take your own personal view and bring it back to the collective. Share that view with others. Your nuanced view may not be so readily accessible to others, but have that courage to try to explain it to your friends and your family. And if you lack confidence in your own ability to critically appraise things and to think thoroughly and thoughtfully about different issues, then supplement your ability to do so by reading broadly. Read the classics, read things that have stood the test of time. By developing your personal perspective, I know that naturally you'll find ways to bring that back to the collective conversation. I hope you found this topic interesting and enjoyed these selected writings from Carl Jung. As always, I'm grateful to have the ability to share my thoughts with you here on this channel. Like this video if you would like more videos similar to this one. I thank you for watching, and as always, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. I'll see you in the next one.